So we are working through a series called Christian Story. And as we did a couple weeks back and the week before that, so make sure we understand what a story is, because in particular, as we start talking about Jesus, this is where the whole Christian story comes together, where it stops being the Jewish story and becomes the Christian story because of the Christ. And that key piece, you have to know what a story is. So what is a story? A character wants something, they overcome obstacles to get it, and they end up transformed as a result. So the idea is there's something that someone wants, and there's struggle to get there, and they're transformed in the process. So if you start to kind of apply that to the Christian story, the Bible, what's in there, the desires to have a relationship with God. That's the starting point, perfect in Eden. And then the conflict enters sin, the thing that causes the division between us and God, the thing that must be overcome to get back to the place we're supposed to be at, that relationship with God, mankind perfectly presenting the image of God on this earth. And then the journey to get there is the Old Testament, the New Testament, that transformation that takes place, God's journey, his plan of restoration. And so the question kind of we asked in your discussion times was, so what's the deal with even the way this course is designed, where we spend so much time on Genesis, Exodus, the law, and then there's like 2 lessons on 50 books of the Bible are covered in 2 weeks, and then we're suddenly in the New Testament. Like, what is up with that? And like, why was there this 1,000-year period of time with this nation and all these prophets and so much history, so many different kings, so much stuff, for 1,000 years, but literally we cover it in 2 weeks. 2 weeks. So as part of this gigantic Christian story, it seems like an odd use of a large chunk of time. Like why is that? And honestly, what was all this stuff kind of about Israel? Why is there so much stuff about a nation if the crux of the story comes about with Jesus? So, what was that all about? Well, so much of it is, why did we go so quickly? Because the Old Testament is very cyclical. It's the same thing over and over again of the people fall into sin, God sends a prophet, they turn back to God, things are good for a little bit, next generation, they fall back into sin, things get really bad, God sends a prophet, they turn back to God, and this repeats kind of for 1,000 years. It just keeps playing out in that same way, and it's not exactly the same every time, and there's certain times they're better than others, and certain times they're pretty bleak for very long stretches of time, but it's this very cyclical time period that repeats this idea over and over and over again. We can't do it on our own. Left to our own devices, we fall into sin. Likewise, our plan of how are we going to be a blessing to the world based on that promise to Abraham, how are we going to be that blessing to the world? The way people normally think is a great nation, that'll do it. What if we could just really be if we had the right king, we'd be awesome. And then they get the right king, David, and it turns out the right king, David, who is a man after God's own heart, is still a sinner. And even a sinner, even a great man, even the best king, can seriously screw up, which is one of those messages that for each and every one of us should be encouraging in one sense and incredibly humbling in another sense of even David, super jacked up. Go, okay. And so we keep getting this over and over again. We can't do it on our own. Our plans don't work. And they keep coming up with their own ideas for how are we going to work our way to God, make things right, and they keep failing. They keep thinking all of these ideas that are wrong for 1,000 years. So why on earth do you have 1,000 years worth of failures? And if you really dive into the Old Testament, the nation after David split in 2, and then over the next few hundred years, both of those kingdoms fell into horrible sin. One was conquered by the Assyrians, the other one was conquered by the Babylonians, and then they go back to the nation eventually, and they think, man, we're going to be able to rebuild the temple, and they kind of do, and they build some walls, but it's nothing compared to what it was before. Why all of that? Well, at its core, to think, if there was any other way, there's any other way to solve the conflict of sin, if there's any other way to overcome our sin problem, that would be better than God humbling himself to the human experience, God taking on sin. If there's any other way, That would be preferred to what had to happen to Jesus. So why was there 1,000 years of all of this stuff? It's showing us we keep failing. There is no other way. Jesus is the way. And that'll bring us to the New Testament and God's plan to overcome the sin problem. Oh, there we go. So 1,000 years of proving there's no other way. Jesus is the way. So that'll bring us to John chapter 1. And we're going to kind of talk about Jesus, what his life meant, life, death, covenant afterwards in kind of 4 parts. First one, God in flesh. It says, John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was the beginning. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then in verse 12 it says, yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. So kind of built into this course right from the beginning, I'm operating from the assumption we assume the premise that Jesus is God and that the Christian story is true. So I'm not going to linger on the idea of trying to prove the divinity of Christ. That's kind of just assumed going into this. But John starts off his gospel and just wants to make it so clear from the very beginning. There's no question in creation, Jesus was there. Everything that was made, Jesus was there. And before he even tells his story of the life of Jesus and the redemption that comes with it, he's like, if you believe in him, you have the right to become a child of God. Before he even tells the story, he tells you exactly where this is all headed to make the point. This is God's plan. This is God coming to us to live a life among us. The God that created everything becomes one of us, becomes a part of his creation. And we talked about how he's, of course, fully God and fully man. And way back in week number 1, we talked about how we're created, or we are made in the image of God. That's so fundamental to who we are. And that word made talks about the idea of us kind of being, it's used for like statue self-portraits. So we are like God doing a self-portrait, but Jesus is actually God in flesh. Not just made in the image of God, not just a self-portrait. He is the perfect version of God in flesh. He's the perfect version of what it looks like to be the image of God on this earth, to live out how God would live out. He's the perfect example of what that means and what it looks like. And it just very briefly kind of talk about analogies for the Trinity and trying to understand all of it and the confusion with it. So there's like 2 analogies that people use a lot that are both incomplete analogies and say, well, God's like an egg. Like you got the shell, you have the yolk, you have the white. So it's like, it's all an egg, but it's just the 3 different things. Okay, let's kind of like that, but kind of like not. That's also, if you believe that, you're also a heretic because it's kind of incomplete because it's 3 parts of God. And it's to say that those are 3 parts of an egg. Those are 3 parts of God. That's not how the Trinity works. It's not that they're the 3 parts of God. And the other one people use is like, well, it's like water. You've got vapor where water is turned into air, and then you have water where it's in liquid form, and then you have it in ice form where it's frozen and it's a solid. And you go, see, that's what the Trinity's like. Well, yeah, but it's not all 3 at the same time. So it's 3 different modes of the same thing, but it's at different times. So it's like that's kind of like it, but it's also an incomplete analogy. You have to combine the 2 together to get the proper idea that it's 3 all at the same time, not 3 different parts. You have to merge them. It's 2 incomplete analogies, and if you believe either one of them, you're a heretic, and Trey would kick you out of the church. So just if you have anything to confess, real quick.
Just try it.
What time is now? The water bag.
Water bedding house, that's fine. But see, think about it, and so sometimes people have been like, well, there's nothing else in the universe that is like this. There's nothing comparable to it, so isn't that a problem with Christianity that you can't even explain the nature of the Trinity? Well, I mean, don't you think it would be a bit of a problem if we could easily explain God? Don't you think that would be a problem? Isn't God by definition bigger, greater, more complex than us or our understanding? And if you stop to think about it, everything that God communicates about himself is him condescending himself into human language and human understanding. All of it is faulty metaphors because he's that much greater than us. You stop and think about like an ant. How much can an ant understand you? What can an ant understand about what you are with an ant's understanding? How much greater is God than us than we are to an ant? And if you think about that, right, there's limitations to our understanding. It's not a contradiction, but it is complex in a way that we can't fully compare to anything else in this universe, which is the definition of God. That's the whole point of what God is. And so I think that's sometimes the discussions about like the Trinity, you go, I think you're kind of missing the idea here. Like, right, God is bigger and greater than us. He's supposed to be. All right, part number 2 on here, we're going to talk about the... Oh, there we go. Main image is God, and then we'll linger on this one a little bit. So the life and ministry of Jesus. So Jesus is born of an actual woman, and of course, that's, once again, we're just going to accept that as part of the class. I'm not going to try to convince you of that. But I think sometimes we go into Bible story mode, and you just play it out as a story. We don't actually play out what we're saying when we mean all of this. And it's just like, Jesus was born in a manger, and we think manger is like a pretty stable, a manger is a feeding trough. And so Jesus is born. Now, I've watched as little footage of births as possible because that was not something that would appeal to me, but that actually happened with Jesus. And then he was placed in a feeding trough because that's where animals lived. And I say those because I want to put it in reality. Where animals feed, they also go poo-poo and pee-pee. And I just want to you just stop and think about the reality of where Jesus was born. That's when God comes into this world, he's born, placed in a feeding trough, and is based off our understanding of the world, the level of quality of life that we expect. Jesus is born where animals live and placed in the thing that they get water from or food from. Just let that image sink into your mind. Along these same ideas, Jesus really lived. Now that seems like, right, yeah, I get it. Let's pull this into reality. He's fully human. Humans go to the bathroom. Have you ever thought about that one? Well, it would be a little bit weird if you spent a lot of time thinking about that, but he was fully human. So all the normal human bodily functions that you have, Jesus had too. And I just say that to let it sink in. He had brothers and sisters. What were those relationships like? You think, what's the perfect brother? Because you still joke around with your brother, but what's the version that doesn't have sin in it? To that point, sometimes versions of Jesus that are filmed, they present him as like this very stoic, serious person, as if joking somehow diminishes his holiness. A person that never jokes doesn't sound like a perfect person to me. So do you think, was he really funny? Was he just able to be super funny in a way that never stepped on people's toes, but just knew exactly where the line was? And what is that to be like a human that doesn't have sin? You just play that out. All of these things are the human experience. We have emotions because God gave them to us. They're not a bad thing. They're not a side effect. They're supposed to be there. That means Jesus had them in some perfect version. And you even get to the shortest verse in the English. Well, I got several things in. Oh, I didn't put it in here. The shortest verse in the English language Bible is Jesus wept. Someone dies. And even with the knowledge that Jesus has, even with whatever that is, if he knew what was going to happen, knew what he was about to do, knew what he could do, the natural human reaction to death, of loss, of the tragedy that even is death, that in existence, people live for a time and then they stop existing. Jesus in that moment has such a human reaction, despite knowing what he can do and is about to do. And it says Jesus wept. It's all that just pause and go, Jesus really was human. and lived the human experience with emotions, with friendships, with brothers, with parents, with normal human bodily functions, all of it. Like you play it out. And so next one on here, Jesus' miracles affirmed his message. We kind of talked on this a little bit. You kind of lingered on that one of someone says, hey, I'm God. Your first thought is, you're probably crazy, until the person starts performing miracles, in which case you go, okay, well, something's up here. Well, all right, probably should pay attention to what this guy's saying. But so, as a little side note on this, sometimes, I know for me, like when I'll think about the Bible, I'll kind of think about, it just feels like everybody in the Bible has like superpowers, and they're just like performing miracles all the time. But if you actually pay attention, if you look at it, the miracles are very much around new revelation. When God appears to his people in a new, special, unique way, suddenly there's a lot of miracles. So, like Abraham's not just walking around like zapping things and multiplying wood, like he's not doing that. But then you get to Egypt, and Moses shows up. And this is a point in time where God is starting something new in revealing himself to his people in a brand new way, setting in motion his plan. All of a sudden he shows up and he legitimately is just left and right performing miracles like, whatever your gods are, Egyptians, here we go. Let me defeat all of them. Here's how our God is better. And then they head on out of there, and he's spreading water, and then there's flames, like clouds of fire and all sorts of stuff, because it was tied to new revelation. You look at like King David, pretty important to the Old Testament, but it's not like, and then King David flew out of the palace. Like it's not going on. He's just a king. And so sometimes you think about it, it seems like everybody has powers, but it's not like that really. It's tied to new revelation. So Jesus shows up, very much to your exact point. He's saying something pretty radical, pretty wild, and so it's right along with it a series of miracles that show he has power over things. And you just kind of play through some of these miracles. He feeds 5,000, so he's a provider. He's healing the sick, so he has power over sickness. He has power over injury. He calms a storm. He has power over the weather. Someone shows up possessed by demons. He casts the demons into the flock nearby, and it goes crazy, and they go running off a cliff. He has power over the demons. Then somebody even dies, and he brings a dead person back. It's like brings them back from the dead. He has power over death. And so you kind of look at it, and at first it just seems like, yeah, he's just doing random miracles. Like it was slowly showing you he has power over all of these key important things. Whatever you think is in control, well, this Jesus is tied to that. And he's telling you what that thing is. He's not being too subtle about it either. It's like, before Jacob Isaac, I am. Like he says that. Like he ties himself to the God of the people he's speaking to in a way that to them was a, let's kill this guy for heresy. Trey will just kick you out of the church if you believe that God, the Trinity's like an ice cube. But he won't kill you though. That's. I really appreciate that about you, is that you won't kill us for that.
Murderous, not here.
At least, yeah, right. Won't admit to it. But so, like, just understanding that all these miracles affirm the message that he's communicating and set up everything that we're working towards. And then the last one on it, Jesus lived the perfect life. So we talked about, 2-3 weeks back, about the law is given. And this was part of God's plan, to set up a criteria, a standard, both for how we live and then the ceremonial law for the sacrifices. And Jesus is perfectly the image of God on this earth. So every choice he makes is perfectly what God would do. It's the exact version of what we are supposed to be doing. What the character of God is lived out through the human experience. And so he lived perfectly represented God, perfectly obeyed the law, perfectly fulfilled all of it. The perfect life. And even if you think what your definition of perfect life is, you probably play out a set of criteria radically different. You say, he lived the perfect life. at 33, he was brutally murdered. You think, well, that's not what I think of a perfect life. That's whew,
Got 8 years left. Can't wait.
But you think our definition of perfect life and his definition of perfect life are a little bit different. And you just kind of play that out of, if the actual purpose here is to glorify God, to be his image, to make much of God, the perfect life isn't, retiring at 65 and whatever that dream is you have of the perfect life. No, it's perfectly being the image of God on this earth, whatever that looks like for however long you have. And that's the perfect life. Radically different from the way we normally perceive of the perfect life. And that'll bring us to the kind of key piece in all of this. Jesus lived, where are we at? There we go. Jesus lived a life that we couldn't live and died the death that we deserved. That'll kind of bring us into part number 3 on this, the death of Jesus. And kind of going back to why on earth was there this 1,000-year time period of the Old Testament with all of these stories? And I don't know about you, but my brain, when I think about 1,000 years when it's way back in the past, my brain kind of condenses it. I think 0 BC to 1,000 BC, or whatever language you're supposed to use now. My brain kind of condenses that into 100 years. I think that's a much shorter time period than 2022 to 1022. You think about how, that much, you think back to 1022 and it's like barbarians and with swords.
What even happened?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
It was pretty crazy back then.
He's speaking from experience. He's been there before.
But you even think about the Old Testament ends. There's 400 years between the end of the Old Testament and Jesus being born. 400 years. Even just go back 400 years. We're 150 years before the United States even forms. That's how long 400 years is. But there's 400 years between the Old Testament and New Testament. Why on earth was there so much time? Because the idea that a holy God would condescend himself and live on this earth and die a humiliating death, an excruciating death, and that a holy God would then take all the sin on himself. That's not what you want to be your plan A. So if there's any other way, if we could do it on our own, that's the plan that you would want. There's 1,000 years showing that can't happen. You even think, what if there hadn't been all that time period and just it was immediately we got the law, Jesus showed up. It's well, could we have done it? Did it need to be like this? Because there's some other plan? What if there's 1,000 years that show we couldn't do it? And there was good people in there, and there's bad people in there, and there's really bad people in there, and there were great people. None of them were good enough until Jesus. And even in that one sense of when we're always trying to think about our own experiences and our own failures, and then you look at the heroes of the Bible, and there's only a few of them that didn't do really, really bad stuff. And all the great people in the Bible, there's only a few that it doesn't say some example of something they did that's yikes, that's messed up. Wow, only a few. And you get to the apostles and they're doubting and they're denying Jesus, and almost every one of them did something bad. And so we get this whole long story that keeps repeating the same idea. Jesus is the only way. And the cross, while being the greatest moment in history, is also the greatest tragedy in that it is the solution to the human problem, sin. It's the answer right there. And it's the culmination of the Christian story, the sin problem. It all comes together in the cross where Jesus defeats it. But it's also the greatest tragedy in human existence, or in all of history, because it is. God has to send himself to die for us who rebelled against him. So Jesus, as in human flesh who lived perfectly out the law, he can stand in our place, but he's also God, this infinite being And our sin against an infinite being is an infinite offense because he's perfectly holy and we've sinned against him. But Jesus, as God in that place, can overcome even an infinite offense because he is an infinite representative. And he stands there on the cross as God, as man, and takes all the sin on him, perfectly fulfilling the law and being a perfect sacrifice. The ceremonial system that we got 3 weeks back in the course, whatever that was, that ceremonial law where it was sacrificing goats, these imperfect sacrifices. Jesus is finally the perfect sacrifice that can once and for all fulfill the whole system. And on the cross, Jesus pays it all, as the song says, completes the requirements of the law. In one moment, dies and is buried. And so kind of tie back to some other things we talked about. In your discussion time, we talked about how does this tie back to Genesis 12? Well, Genesis 12, this is kind of the kickstart of the Christian story. Everything before that's kind of the prologue. And then the story kicks in. And God makes this promise to Abraham. And the final piece in there, he says, all peoples on earth will have a blessing through you. And that little promise right there, it's running all throughout the Old Testament. And finally, we get the answer to it with Jesus. And it says in Galatians 3, Scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announced the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who rely on faith are blessed through Abraham, the man of faith. What is the blessing? It's the forgiveness of sin. That's the Christian story, all of it being this promise made in Genesis 12, fulfilled in the act on the cross. And then 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. The whole story. God desires to have a relationship with us that we can be his image on this earth. Sin creates the problem. We try 1,000 things for 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years, because it was much longer between the first original sin and Jesus. Thousands of years, try all these things to try and overcome the problem. Doesn't work. And then ultimately, Jesus is the solution. He dies, he's buried, but he's God. And he has power over sin, and he has power over death, which he demonstrated to us in his life. And he conquers the grave, and Jesus is resurrected. And that'll lead us to the kind of the final piece on here, a new covenant. Where we've talked about a series of covenants all throughout the previous lessons. And then we get to the New Testament, and we enter this covenant of grace, where it's no longer a series of ceremonies we have to perform. The ceremony's been fulfilled. The sacrifice has been made. And God makes a covenant with us that's entirely based off grace. Mercy is when we don't get what we deserve. Grace is getting something that we don't deserve. A relationship with God. We deserve God's wrath. We get mercy. And then, once again, we deserve wrath, but we get gracefully a relationship with God and forgiveness. And it's activated by faith, not a series of works, not a series of actions. So it says in Ephesians, verse 5, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved. And then in verse 8, it says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith, and it is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Whole idea. I didn't do it. Christ did. I didn't earn it. Christ did. I sinned. I deserved wrath. But God is rich in grace, made us alive. And that's the new covenant that we live under. And like as a church, we don't believe that you can lose your salvation. And so much that ties back to the full theology. It's not just, well, a verse says that you can't. No, it's a theology of, I was dead in my sin, and Christ made me alive. If I'm alive, I didn't work my way out of my sin. I can't sin my way out of my salvation. I can't sin my way out of what Christ already did on the cross for me. It all goes back to that covenant that God made, covenant of grace, and a theology, not just proof texting a random verse that says the thing that I want it to say. And so that's obviously we're covering a whole lot with a single lesson of the whole life of Jesus, the theology of the Trinity, and salvation, redemption, covenant. So covering very quickly, but trying to help you see how it ties together all this stuff in the Old Testament. That it's easy to kind of miss those pieces. And as much as I keep repeating certain ideas, it's because that is the through line. That's what ties it together and makes for a cohesive narrative. And it's why we're calling the class the Christian story, because we want you to get that through line. So whenever you hear all these different stories, you know where it falls in that journey. You hear all these stories in the Old Testament about these prophets. Oh, that's one of those pieces where the people once again fell into sin and they could not on their own fulfill the law. They couldn't do it, and God had to send someone to pull them back. You start to just realize how it falls together into this greater narrative and realize that all of it was building towards Jesus. All of it was pointing towards the fact that Jesus is the way.